Y'all doing okay this morning? Doing good. I love it. Well, I want to continue today in a little bit of a part 2 from last week. And we're still rooted in those 3 verses at the end of chapter 2 in Ephesians that we can't get away from. And the whole idea there, and we're not going to read it today, Paul is admonishing the people in Ephesus, answering a question of who is the church? And he's saying, well, you're fellow citizens. And then he's like, yeah, but you're more than that. And he says, you're brothers and sisters, your family. Like, yeah, but you're more than that because you have a cornerstone. That is Jesus. And what he's doing in this thing called the church was this beautifully messy as he's forming you and fitting you together and your beauty and your chaos, your dysfunction and your giftings. And he's making you the dwelling place of his Spirit for the sake of the world. And so we're leading into, as Bridge Church, what does that look like for us? And so I'm going to bounce out of Ephesians chapter 2 and into right in the middle of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, into Matthew 7, and I'll invite you one more time to stand because we do it. Matthew chapter 7, these are the words of Jesus, verses 13 and 14. It says, enter through the narrow gate. Are we up? Nailed it. Good job, guys. Good job. Anyways, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. On your way down, just tell someone around you that they look nice today, that they look nice. Tell your second choice, you don't look as nice as my first choice, apparently, and have a seat. Do you all shower over here? Did everyone shower on this side? Why are we are full here, we're full here, and some of y'all, you smelling? I don't know. Let's I love it. So let's get into it. You ready? Jason Green was the senior editor of Pitchfork, which was a popular online publication that reviewed the albums of indie rock bands. And he had turned that hobby into a career, gotten married, and carved out a little life for himself in New York City. And he and his wife, Stacy, were in those first tumultuous years of parenting when your life is turned upside down by the sudden intrusion of a baby. Anyone been there before? Maybe you're hoping for it. It is intrusive. They were turned upside down in ways you honestly can't accurately explain, only profoundly experience. Turned upside down in ways that interrupt and affect everything, and turned upside down in ways that you would never, ever trade back if you could. Their 2-year-old daughter, Greta, was everything to them. And one weekend, Greta was having a sleepover with her grandma on the Upper West Side with a little respite for the weary parents. And Greta and Grandma were sitting on a bench right near Central Park when a brick tumbled from a windowsill above, striking Greta in the head and killing her instantly. It was an absolute freak accident. And in the years that followed, Jason, the writer of indie album reviews, became the author of a memoir about the maze of grief he was never really able to find a way out of. A few years later, Tyler, a dad living in the same city whose youngest child, Amos, was in the hospital living his first 30 days off machines, his heart rendered open because it wasn't assembled correctly in the womb. Tyler was living in the limbo of those days and dozing off at night, reading Jason's memoir. As he describes it, it was a potentially ill-advised decision. And as he read Jason's memoir, what struck Tyler about Jason's journey through grief was how he talked about God. For Jason, if there is a God, he's a monster. He is the cruel taker of life and the permitter of evil. If there is a God, then he is to blame for Greta's tragic story and every other one like it. But for Tyler, God was his lifeline. He was the only one who could possibly carry him through those 30 days. He was the creator of everything good, the sustainer of life, and the one fighting a cosmic battle against evil and the tragedy of death, even Greta's. 2 dads, 2 kids, so much in common, yet God was such a different character in their imaginations as they lived their respective stories. Stephen Fry, a comedian and outspoken atheist, was once interviewed and asked what he might say if upon dying he was confronted by a God who actually did turn out to exist. To which he instinctively responded, "I'd say bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain?" Jerry Sitzer, he's a lifelong follower of Jesus and the author of A Grace Disguised, which is a book chronicling his loss, the loss of his wife and 2 of his 4 children from one accident at the hands of a drunk driver. But it's also about the God who buoyed their sinking and broken family through all of that loss and towards redemption. Same God, very different perspectives on who he is and the role he plays in the world. Some Christians in the 17th century American church used the Bible as a defense of the transatlantic slave trade. Some slave masters sat in pews on Sunday morning singing hymns, and they read their Bibles and they prayed each morning while owning and abusing other people. Howard Thurman authored the brilliant book, Jesus Through the Eyes of the American Slave. In it, he portrays God as the one who walks beside the oppressed, speaks for the voiceless, and fights for the powerless. So important was this book that outside of Scripture, it became Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s greatest influence in rallying our nation against its sins of racism. Same God, different perspectives on who that God is and the role he plays in the world. And into that world, with that God, here we are. Bringing our stories, bringing our experiences, bringing our questions, bringing our stories of loss and tragedy, our stories of unexpected divorce and regrettable decisions, our stories of infertility and grief, our stories of debilitating depression and relentless anxiety that won't go away, our stories of unimaginable hurt at the hands and words and abuse of others, our stories of unmet expectations and the feelings of wandering about without a sense of meaning and purpose, our stories of legitimate disappointment, disillusionment, and hurt because of this messy thing called church that Paul seems to think is really important and Matt won't quit talking about. Stories upon stories upon stories. And in that, the same God, with different perspectives on who that God is and the role he plays in the world. So, in a world where all of that stuff happens, in a world where your stuff happens, some kind of struggle with doubt only makes sense, right? Last week I said that doubt was not the enemy of your faith, it was an invitation into greater faith. And it's true. But that doesn't always match our experience. It's not where doubt always leads. And even if it does get there eventually, the journey getting there is often very painful and very disoriented. I mean, what happens when doubt doesn't lead to more faith? It actually leads to less faith, at least temporarily, or much longer than you'd prefer. What happens when doubt makes you question, well, everything? And by association, everyone who's now part of that thing you are doubting. What happens when doubt leads to less hope and less faith and less stability and less trust in God? Is there a word for that kind of journey? Is it normal? Is it to be expected and embraced or denounced and avoided? Is there any hope in that kind of journey? And is this us, you together, the people you're rubbing shoulders with, that we've made you say hello to 5 times now, is there a safe place for me in that particular kind of journey? So in a continuation of last week's message, our conversation needs another layer. Last week was about doubt and faith. Today is about doubt and deconstruction. Now, I want to speak to 3 kinds of people this morning. 1, there's those of you that are currently white-knuckling your way through doubt and deconstruction, holding on for dear life, feeling like you're at an impasse. Then there's those of you that are watching someone you love go through that journey and you're trying to hold their hand. And number 3, there's those of you that are like, been there, done that. Let me help you in the journey. There is something on the other side. Which are you in that? So let's talk. And let's begin with this statement. Deconstruction, this whole idea, the concept, it's a loaded term. It is a loaded term. This is when you go to Fireside and you don't settle for just the baked potato. You add some butter and you add some cream and some chives and some bacon and then a little extra cheese. And you're like, can you stick that potato under the broiler and crisp it up a little bit? You're like, make sure the skin is salted and bring me a side of vinegar if I really want to get my palate rolling. Like, this is that level of complication and loadedness. It's also loaded because, like, it's emotional. This is an emotional concept with an emotional journey attached with people that we've emotionally been connected to, that sometimes their journey through this really nebulous term led to more faith and others that led to, like, no faith at all. It's also really challenging for us who feel settled in our apprenticeship with Jesus because it is unsettling. The notion of challenging what is very, very unsettling. And I like being settled, and it feels good here. My potato is just fine with a little salt and pepper. Leave me alone. And so, some of you in the room, and the third reason this is really loaded is because this term itself, immediately where your minds went, is very different than where someone else's mind went, because it means a million different things to a million different people for a million different reasons. Some of you in the room might describe yourself as a deconstructed Christian, and what you mean by that is you've walked a journey of growth and maturity, and you're learning and you're unlearning some things, and you realize you're like really reliant on other allegiances, and then you found Jesus. That's one thing. Some of you are like, I'm deconstructed. I don't have any faith. I'm just showing up so people don't ask me, and because that person sitting beside me made me come. And you both might describe yourself as a deconstructed Christian. Some of you might say, I'm deconstructing. And here's a key difference in this, is that when we talk about deconstruction, motives matter. Because some deconstruct for the purpose of destruction, to destroy, and some deconstruct with the intent to rebuild. And so this whole thing is loaded. And can I be honest? I'm going to be real honest today. Is that this whole idea, as good as it can be, and as destructive as it can be, is a little trendy right now. And so it's a little weird to even think about, like, is this just a trend we're going through? Or is this something that's rooted in something greater and more formative? And my argument is that it's both, and it depends on which way you embrace this whole thing. It's having its viral moment. Jump on TikTok right now and the search, like, deconstructed Christian. You'll find lots of influencers that are having massive platforms because of that. And they are everywhere on the spectrum, from, like, no longer Christian to, like, I'm the most Christian I've ever been because I've been able to hone in on what this thing is actually about. So it's a wide, wide spectrum. And in its trendiness, what can get lost is that this whole idea, there's a little bit of academic stuff at the beginning today, but it matters today. I'm going to be a professorial a little bit today. I'm trying to be less like that, but this needs that voice today. Because to get to the prophetic aspect of this, we need to have that stuff in our bag. Deconstruction is something that's very quickly moved from the realm of, like, academic obscurity to the popular culture. And origin stories matter. Origin stories matter for shaping how we walk that journey. So some fear this conversation while others embrace it. Some think it's the end of Christianity. Others think it's the only path forward. It's loaded. It's loaded. But here's why we're opening up that parking spot today, and probably next week. Here's why. It's because we're a church that makes room for doubt. We're a church that wants to follow Jesus. And that requires learning and unlearning. and it requires embracing things that maybe don't square to the cornerstone of Jesus, but we thought they did. Because we're a church that makes room for struggling, questioning, challenging, messy people and all their stuff. And if we're going to love people well, we need to understand people well. And this is a controversial statement. We make room for this conversation because we follow Jesus. He's our teacher. And he's our teacher who himself practiced, I mean this loosely, a form of deconstruction with the church of his day. Just read the Sermon on the Mount. Hey guys, you've heard it said, but I say, what's he doing? He's just deconstructing their paradigm to reimagine it in the way of Jesus in particular. So we follow Jesus. He sets our trajectory. So let's take a moment. Let's declutter the junk drawer. This is an absolute junk drawer of a concept. Anyone else have a junk drawer in your kitchen? We've graduated to 2 of them. Anyone have more than 2? All right, there's an intervention class in the coffee shop afterwards. We are going to deconstruct and reconstruct the junk drawers of our kitchen. So let's define the term out of the junk drawer mess that it is. And not to be annoying about it and confusing, but there's really 2 ways to define this. There's the actual academic version that shaped its origin stories, and then there's the way we think it works today as a trendy Christian thing, which has a lot of merit. But I would just say it's actually what thousands of years of church history have called spiritual formation. Hold on to the good, leave the bad. Learn, follow Jesus. Shake off the bad stuff, grow up. Anyways, there's the message in a statement. And I want you to see both because, again, it matters. So here is the textbook definition. This is not my version. This is like Merriam-Webster's dictionary. It is to analyze, particularly a text or a linguistic or a conceptual system, think like Christianity, by deconstruction. Why? Typically in order to expose its hidden internal assumptions and contradictions and subvert its apparent, which means it's fragile, like its apparent significance or unity. 2, the second aspect is to reduce something to its constituent parts in order to reinterpret it. Now that definition comes from somewhere. Just give me 3 minutes of nerding out with you. It came on the scene by guys like French philosophers like Jacques Derrida, and lost the other name that was the typical one. Jacques Derrida is one of them, and Foucault, in the 20th century as a response to the Enlightenment, which elevated rationalism and said humans will make progress by their own merit based on the way they understand and think about the world. It began to take the sacred out of the core public conversation and remap power and authority to our rationale. We were walking sticks with brains, is the way we conceived of ourselves, and that was going to create progress. They looked around the world and were like, that's promised that the world was going to get more just and better because we're smarter. And they looked around and said, that's not what's happening. So they philosophically started to ask questions like, why is the world still so unjust in spite of all of our thinking and understanding and our progress? So it started as a falafel question. It started as a falafel question with some good hummus and some philosophical question that then got injected into high-level academia. And then the question created I'm just nerd. I'm going to use the word. A construct of methodology to interpret systems and concepts and books and anything that had power and influence in the world that made objective, rational claims to truths that existed outside the authority of the individual, therefore did not find its home in our interpretation, but on their own they held merit. That makes sense? So they began to look at They began to question everything, all right? So they would look at a book like the Bible through a particular, interrogative gaze. And the idea was, because this holds claims of truth, that people are giving authority, then inherently there must be some contradictions that invalidate any of its claims to a moral or a scriptural or a storied authority over people. So you don't look at a book like the Bible and say, man, I am but a wee human. Help me, Jesus, understand this and unlearn and learn some things. No, it looks at this and says, because it holds authority in the world, there must be something wrong, because that means it's inherently oppressive towards people. Have people used it oppressively? Of course, I just said that people in the 18th century used it as a means to justify owning and abusing people. But they're not challenging the way we used it. They're challenging its very essence and nature and purpose in the world. You following that? So Derrida and Foucault, and they're creating a whole construct by which you look at everything and you look at it and say, because it makes claims to truth, because it has authority, it must be bad. It must be hiding behind inherent contradictions. So in its origins, the intended function of the high academic purpose of deconstruction, which led to things like postmodernism, which in the West has lead to lead to post-Christian culture and the hyper-individualism that we live and the elevation of secularism, is to destroy. As many of us understand deconstruction, it's, man, I grew up in a church that was like semi-racist. That doesn't seem like Jesus. I'm going to get rid of that. We are for that. And people call that deconstruction. I'm cool with that. But I want you to see that when we throw the word deconstruction at an academic level, when you start having these conversations with people, when you think about your journey and your motive, there's two ways to think about this. It's not about an honest and humble attempt to live in the tension that the Bible is authoritative, but I am not the final authority on its interpretation. It's not about saying, of course, that's not what the Bible meant when we can justify slavery. No. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bath water. It's actually aggressive. It has in its heart a mentality of a takedown. It's not a little, I wrote this is kind of gross. It's not a little squirming tadpole that sprouts legs and drags itself up a beach. One thing becoming a new thing, but still the same thing. Deconstruction is an angry boot on the slippery-limbed fish before its gills ever take their first breath. Okay? We're not talking about what the first just sounded like, maturity, growth, change. So for apprentices of Jesus, that's what I would call unhealthy deconstruction. Are you okay? I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. We need this. And it's in a journey of the language of Jesus actually abandons the narrow way that leads to life. I need to reframe that probably next week more deeply. But it reframes it for the broad way that leads to destruction. But at the same time, before we sound real intellectual and uppity and mad at all the deconstructionists, we're a house that leads with compassion and empathy, and realize that there are 99% of the time, in my humble, non-academic scholarly survey, believes that like the reason people deconstruct their way out of faith with a bone to pick is because they have a legit bone to pick. So the question is not, are there bones to pick? The question is, are you going to just pick the bones and leave the flesh? Leave the fish? Eat the fish, leave the bones? Or are you just going to throw the plate in the garbage? Are we going to work through our journeys of healing communally so that your story, who's further down the road, can come up along a struggling younger apprentice of Jesus and say, I've been through that journey before. I had that same question. And here's what I read. Here's what I journeyed. And let me just tell you, this ain't where you are, but like, you'll never know, my friend. But I'm happy to hold your hand down that part of the path. It's brutal, and it's stormy and dark, and there are thorns trying to get you down that narrow way. Don't throw the baby out. Don't throw the baby out. Don't throw the baby out. It's understandable. And maybe that's where you sit today. Maybe your journey is not like I've never considered that theological thought. Maybe it's a lot more angsty. Can you believe what that pastor did? Can you believe the amount of talk they give about how angry they are at these people. Can you believe the way they've used the Bible to justify their hatred of people who are different than them? Maybe it's not that. It's angsty from a legit hurt. And that angstiness creates the gap by which you come at an impasse. And the impasse says, do I transform and keep following Jesus and work through this in community? Or I deconvert and deconstruct, and do I let the shift in my heart become less about I want to be fully devoted to Jesus and let all the other stuff fall off? Or because I see all the other stuff in my hurt and in my anger and in my disappointment, I get disillusioned and I'm ready to tear the whole thing down. Wherever you are, we have space for that. Let me tell you, there are very legitimate reasons you get to those places. About 10 years ago, I was in South Africa for the summer, and one of my work projects for the week became some really weird work in the attic of the cottage, those of you that have been there. And what had happened is Sarah Ogle had come to serve at Funanani Ministries in Majajisklu, South Africa, and she made like a multi-year commitment. And she put her life on hold. She discerned the call, she prepared, she'd raised money, and arrived full of excitement, expectation, and inspiration to serve. She'd gone all in. She changed her whole life. And for the first few months, everything was amazing. But about 3 months in, she started to develop a cough. And at first, it was a dry cough in her throat, like a tickle that she couldn't kick, or a season allergy from pollutants her alien body had yet to process. Then a couple months later, the dry cough had become a wet cough, and the concerns began to grow as her body further broke down. And on more than one occasion, the wet cough landed her in the hospital, needing breathing treatments and testing that wasn't showing any reason as to why. So no ultimate treatment plan followed. But one night, during an intense storm, a leak developed in her kitchen ceiling. And what began as a drip through the drywall, by morning had given way under the weight of the leak to a 3-foot-wide hole in her kitchen floor. She woke up, she heard it, but she was too tired to mess with it. And when she got up the next morning, she began to clean, and what she noticed was something in the debris. Mixed in with the white ceiling refuse and dust were pill-shaped remnants of mouse droppings. And not just a little, like a lot, to which she had the normal thought, if there's this much mouse poo from this random spot in the kitchen, how much more is up there? What am I actually dealing with? So she investigated her curiosity. She grabbed a chair, stood on it, poked her head above the ceiling, and pointed her flashlight down the labyrinth of beams in old construction to discover a ceiling covered with like a blanket of carpet in mouse droppings and urine stains. Covered. And I don't mean like spots. I mean like it was like an inch thick of poo everywhere. And her suspicions were later confirmed that this was the thing making her sick. And so during my week stay that summer, part of my job for about 3 weeks was to put on a mask that I hoped helped and vacuum out the mouse droppings of that ceiling. Like that's the ceiling. That's the ceiling. Sitting on those beams, climbing around with a shop vac, blowing up dust and mouse poo. So me and a friend that was staying, spent 3 weeks in that attic, and we vacuumed the whole thing, and then we sprayed it down with chemicals that I don't know what they did, but we're still alive. And we attempted in my non-constructive abilities to cover all the holes in the attic space. And during that time, Sarah moved in with the neighbors, and guess what? Gradually, her health came back. And in that real-life story, we see a bit of what the healthy journey of deconstruction can be like. Something is off. Something's maybe making us sick or appear sick to the world. You learn something new, or you learn something wasn't true the way you thought it was true. And rather than burn down the house, you just do something different. Rather than burn down the house, you clean up and clean out what's infected. And you hold on to the good, and you keep going forward. I would define healthy deconstruction like this. that it's a sincere examination of your beliefs, seeking to let go of what is untrue so you can hold on to what is true. But more than true, what's real, what can be not just known up here, but experienced in here. And it's not an individual journey, it's one that requires other people who can see your blinders and your blind spots, who've been on the same path, endeavoring to walk the narrow way, that are finding life on the other side of their doubts and death and stuff, and they come alongside and you're like, hold on. Remember the harp story last week? I mean, who's good at the harp? What sort of dedication does it take to become good at the harp? It's a sincere examination of the church, seeking to let go of its out of whack, is what I wrote. Here, let's just say out of whack allegiances, practices, and beliefs that are untrue, so that you can hold on to what is real. It's a genuine journey through your hurts and your woundedness, so that you don't end up at the end of the day, over years and years or decades of struggle, still blaming God for the actions of broken people, and throw out God because of the actions of the imperfect. Which is still, like, I lead with that thought, with compassion for the hurt. It's ultimately a journey that has to take place in community. Healthy deconstruction, really just spiritual formation. This is the journey we're actually invited into. It's just a form of discipleship on journey that often comes through doubt. Can I say something this morning? Like, right now, regardless of where you are with this journey with Jesus, even myself, like, there are things that right now I believe about God that are probably really not true. I've probably projected my hurts and my triggering political thoughts, and I've made God in my own image in ways that I'm blind to. And it's dangerous that sometimes if I'm not aware of that and really working through that I then just project it onto you all, and we just become another tribe that's angry about the same things but not really devoted to the narrow way that is defined by Jesus, not by my projections. And so, like, I need to unlearn some things I've learned. You probably need to unlearn some things you've learned. There may even be entire theological frameworks that you've adopted that need a good mouse poop cleaning. And then bleached, and then sealed up, and then walk away and be like, I could still be wrong. Y'all help me. When you discover something you believe isn't true, what do? That's the impasse. And that's the invitation. Don't burn down the house. Get rid of the poo. Like, don't burn the house. Get rid of the poo. Yes, loudly, poo. Get rid of it. And then bleach that stuff. And then seal it up and walk the journey with other people. Don't burn the house down. If unhealthy deconstruction is about destruction, healthy deconstruction, which I just want to say is the normal, long-held journey of spiritual formation, is about reconstruction. Think about your development as a human. Think about those of you raising babies and toddlers and kids. They are constructing a worldview right now. Eventually, it won't match with their experience because regardless of our ability, they're exposed to all kinds of other beliefs and all kinds of other hurts and all kinds of things. They will have to begin to ask, like, I love mom and dad. I think that pastor knew what he was doing. I love my small group leader. I love my friends, but, like, I think we got this off. That's a good thing. That's what it is to grow and to mature and to begin to walk with Jesus down the narrow way that is less about having exclusive access to all the most real truth and is more about walking the narrow devotion to Jesus who holds all those things. And I'm not maybe meant to know all of those things that he holds, but I am meant to be fully devoted to the one who holds those things. Deconstruction seeks to tear down the holder of all things beautiful. And reconstruction seeks to make my primary allegiance and devotion and desperation in my heart towards Jesus whatever that looks like, whatever things I have to lay down and whatever things I need to pick up, whatever things that I need to heal from and whatever things I need to forgive and whatever things that I need to help create healthy boundaries with people who aren't on the same path with me, but in a very loving, open-handed, invitational way. I put something out this week on Facebook. It was a little stir-the-pot moment. And I used the line that Jesus, who's our example, who we are apprentices of. He's like, man, it's such a remarkable idea that we get to do that with him. He in his life that we know of was like utterly dependent and devoted to God the Father, right? Utterly. Like there was no questioning his loyalty, his allegiance, the posture of his heart towards that was the thing that held life for him. But what was his posture towards people? Unbelievably open-handed, unbelievably broad. And we've fallen for a thing in the American church, in the way of the valley, that says you can't be open to people and devoted to Jesus at the same time. We use the scripture like narrow is the way versus broad the way. But what if that is less about like our feeble, fallen, sinful beings like having a full grasp of the beauty and the depth of God, and more about like your devotion is down the narrow way, that it's going to feel like death, look like death, and cause you to put things away, but it will lead to life. But the devotion that gets wide, the devotion that gets so like conservative, to use a word, that you just hate everyone and make no room for anything new, actually leads to death eventually. And the wide path that is just so progressive that everything is equal and nothing means anything, and you're swimming about in clouds of tolerant uncertainty, whatever this is, that's also going to lead to death. But the narrow way of devotion to Jesus, who is our strategic uncertainty, is the way to life. And what if we need to deconstruct? I hate that word, actually. I'm just trying to meet you where you are. I don't know that there is healthy deconstruction. I think there's just deconstruction, and then there's spiritual formation. There's following Jesus. There's embracing it. But I'm going to meet you and say we can rename it healthy deconstruction. Eventually, we won't. It's about reconstruction and devotion to Jesus. Every one of us is changing and transforming. You will go to bed different than you did today. I'm trying to go to bed at least a little bit weighing less than I do this morning. Like at least that, Jesus, for your glory and for the sake of others. Like let's embrace that. So well, Matt, that sounds great and all, but seems a little loosey-goosey. Like who gets to define this way of Jesus? Sounds like a real pastoral, slick thing that now I'm going to define what that narrow way is for you, that's going to match my projections and my hurts and my political allegiances. You know what I'm saying? Anyone ever been there? I already deconstructed from that pastoral relationship. Don't do this to me, bro. Thought you were bridge. You build bridges, not barriers. Yay. I thought you were different. Here's what I mean, and we'll have to flesh this out because we're doing this narrow road thing for a long time together. We clean the mouse poo from the house that is classically defined as orthodoxy, which is just the accumulated wisdom and accountability of many centuries of the Jesus movement that discerns in community what teachings and practices align with Jesus and what departs from him. Certainly, things that have been referred to as orthodoxy in the past have also been a means to oppress people. Put that in your theological and historical pipe and smoke it. It's hard, this thing. That's why it's narrow. Anyways, so it has room for that. And can I put my cards on the table for a minute? There's more to this list, but let me put a little flesh on those bones. I believe in the triune God of the Bible. I believe in God who Jesus called Father. I believe that Jesus of Nazareth is, as he put it, the way, the truth, and the life, that his life, teachings, death, burial, and resurrection are historical realities and spiritual necessities for every single person who has ever been created to save us out of our own sin and lifelessness and death and into life eternal with him as participants and co-laborers in that journey for other people. I believe that no one comes to the Father except through Jesus, and I believe that the Spirit of Jesus continues to equip, direct, transform, and convict followers of Jesus. Here's trickier. I believe that the Bible is inspired by God and written by humans at the same time, and as such is still trustworthy and authoritative, and here's the line though, in everything it intends to say and teach. I also admit that understanding the Bible and what the Bible intends to say and teach is complicated. And so the Bible is often misunderstood and abused while being oversimplified by some and overly shrouded in mystery by others. And I also believe that the only venue, the only container designed by God for carrying out lifelong apprenticeship to Jesus and for learning and obeying the way of Jesus is the imperfect but beautiful gathering together of fellow sojourners that we call the church. And all of that is really complicated. And all of that sometimes needs to replace the baseboards that are rotten in the corner. And it needs to slap some new paint on the archaic thinking. And it needs to change its method and move the door over here because more people want in, but they don't want to come in. They're not asking that question anymore. And sometimes you need to move the parking lot with more spaces to this corner because no one's circling the lot asking those questions anymore. Sometimes you have to clean the mouse poo out of the attic without burning down the house. I'm going to throw it in. As we have this conversation, I don't have time for it, but I'm just going to prophetically voice it. I think maybe that what we're seeing by a lot of people my age and under that is, quote, trending as healthy deconstruction, sometimes is an overreaction and sometimes is the healthiest reaction we could possibly have. But I think what's happening more so than like claims about orthodoxy and not and the role of the Bible and stuff is actually what we're seeing is the complete collapse of cultural Christianity. The complete collapse of I'm a Christian, but I'm not really like the Jesus of the Bible. I think what we're seeing is a collapse of like, why are all the Christians mapping their political allegiances there? Why is their tone so mad at the very people I thought God said we're supposed to reach? I think that what is collapsing more so around us is just the idea that Christianity has become so normalized in our culture that it's just been stable at the level of surface and power, and as those things are falling away, you're left with one of two options. You get out, like you realize like there's actually only one way to truly go after Jesus with devotion and love and center on him, or like, oh, I actually just like when we were in power of the school boards and the local politics. Oh, I actually only like when these people thought the same way I did. Oh, I actually only liked when this was the commonly held view of sexuality. Like, hit all your triggering questions, and I think part of the deconstruction trend here is the question of whether or not we've mapped ourselves onto a healthier or a cultural form of Christianity, but not a way of life apprenticing with Jesus. Are you tracking it all? That may, like, I don't know. Like, we'll open that can more down the road. So I guess the question is, like, who do we want to become? And who are we making space for? And what's in our attic and in your attic and in the attic of Bridge Church? Will we be the type of people who walk and are on our own journeys to the degree that we have something to offer other people down the line? So here we are, a room full of stories, room full of experiences, a room full of questions, same God, and different perspectives on who that God is and the role he plays in the world. And to close, I'm going to invite you to stand, and we're not going to do a song today. I'm going to mix it up, okay? Would you stand? And I want to read to you a bit of a fable almost. I want you to close your eyes and open yourself up to this. I want you to, the imagery that it conveys, I want you to picture yourself there. So there's an apprentice. The young apprentice was raised among monks and lapsed sages. They told the young apprentice, "You must choose for yourself a master." And the apprentice wondered aloud, "Won't I follow the same master under whose teaching I've been trained?" But the sages told him, "You must make that decision for yourself. If I decide to follow the master, how do I follow him?" One of the old sages, bent and bruised from a lifetime of his own apprenticeship, leveled a single trembling finger at two paths that opened before them. The first road was wide and accommodating, its terrain a flat and even blanket of soft green grass. The sky was bright blue and cloudless overhead. A homely wooden sign marked the path. On its gnarled, weathered surface was a single fixed word: death. To the left, the second road was nothing like the first. Tight and winding, overgrown thorns and brambles lining both sides, a canopy of leafless branches enclosed overhead like a tapestry of splintering bone. It was dark and foreboding, and set before it was a sign not unlike the first in appearance, but written across it was a different word: life. The lapsed sage said, "If you choose to follow him, the master will lead you and be with you on the road that leads to life." The apprentice was afraid. He said, "The master's road scares me. The other road looks easier to travel." "It is," the sage told him, "but it leads to death. I'm afraid that if I walk the master's road, I might die. You will, and then you will live. Suppose I should choose no masters." All of us choose masters. All other masters you will find on the wide, bright, beautiful road. Later in the journey, the narrow road had become an uphill battle that few of the master's followers cared to sustain. The apprentice watched them as they went downhill in the path of least resistance, dozens of them at a time. The wind against them, his legs shaking. The apprentice squinted through the rain, the snaking white filaments of lightning that bisected the dark dome of sky overhead. He was trying to see the master. It seemed as if everyone who had walked with the apprentice was gone. He felt lonely and afraid. He listened to the grumbling of those who passed on their way back down, heading back the way they'd come. Their pain and frustration sounded like his, and he imagined joining them. It felt as if everything, though, the wind, the others, even the current of his own heart was pulling him away from the master. He felt the strength in his legs waver, and he stumbled. The apprentice peered behind him and watched as those who had renounced the journey found one another below. They linked arms in their retreat, their faces masks of joy and relief. They were coming together around the cause of turning back, around falling away, and the wind was no longer against them. All of them looked very similar, as they had come from similar places at similar times, and this too comforted the apprentice because they looked like him. The apprentice began to pivot, if only slightly, and then the master called his name. The master's voice was not harsh, not even corrective. It was gentle, but self-assured, punctuated by a probing question mark. The apprentice knew then the significance of the moment. What was at stake? He watched the former apprentices gathered below in what looked like happy camaraderie. He considered for a moment all he was prepared to leave behind. And before beginning his descent, the apprentice drew a deep breath, and he turned to the master's face. The master's face was calm, though the world around him was torn by hardship and trouble. While the former apprentices were finding relief on the way down, the uphill climb looked more unforgiving than ever. The trees that lined the narrow road were bent by the gale, the master himself drenched by the storm. But then a flicker of a movement somewhere in the distance caught the apprentice's eye. As the winding journey upward carried on into the distance, the apprentice could see that there were others still climbing. There were hundreds of them, thousands, millions and more. They were battered, bruised, and bedraggled by the journey, but on they went. There were too many to count, too many to compare, but the apprentice could see they were all ages and colors, all ethnicities and nationalities. They come from all over the world to walk the road, men and women and children, and on they went, following the master against the storm. And it occurred to the apprentice that he would rather be forgotten than remembered for giving in. Below was the deconstruction. The siren call to take all of it down, to leave all of it behind. Above was the transformation, the slow and painful lifelong work through questions and doubts, learning and growing, being wrong, falling down, getting up, and following the master. And so the apprentice said in response, "Yes, master?" And again the master bid him, "Come and die, follow me." And the apprentice said, "Yes, master." The revolution was faithfulness. Faithfulness to the historic movement that brought people together of all ages and genders and colors and places, where they were powerful, whether they were powerful or poor, academics or day laborers, over and against those who distorted the way and in defiance of the flimsy faux spirituality of our own design. Below were the digital pseudo-luminaries in their balsa wood cathedrals built like echo chambers to send their own voices back to them again and again. And the apprentice would leave them to their threadbare patchwork spirituality, their hazy catchphrase theology of the God in the reflection. The wide road leads to death. Death to the wide road. Death to the gods made in our image, the golden calves of bailing out. Long is the way and hard that out of hell leads up to light. The way down was faster. The way up slower by a lifetime and more. Death to deconstruction. Death to the path of least resistance and the status quo. Death to the empty inherited religiousness of a plastic Christian culture, and death to the swinging pendulum that reacts against it with unthinking abandonment and pseudo-spirituality. Death to politicized faith and death to politicized deconversion. May God tear down the idols and infrastructures of the proud, be they televangelists or influencers, pulpits or podcasts. Below was the deconstruction, but ahead was the movement, the way. Against the storm, the apprentice went with his blood thruming in his heart and his mind. Below was the giving up. Ahead was the rebellion. He reclaimed faithfulness as an act of rebellion. So Jesus, here we are. Some in the room, some online, some years maybe down the road listening to this are sitting at an impasse. They found some stuff in the attic. And the question they're facing is legitimate. And the legitimacy of that hurt and disillusionment is causing them to want to burn the house down. Holy Spirit, I ask that you meet them in that impasse, where you met me in that impasse, where you met other journeyers in this thing called apprenticeship with Jesus at the impasse. May we create space at the impasse to always host the conversation, to host relationship, to guide and to love and to forgive and to reconcile and work through our stuff so that when the impasse comes for our friends and our loved ones and the next generation and the thousands of people in the valley who are slowly sinking down into what's left after cultural Christianity falls away, and they're sitting there wondering, is the God of my mom and dad actually real? Is the church I grew up in nothing but a tribalistic machine of grandiosity, enemy hate, and money laundering? Is the Jesus of the Bible the Jesus I can actually meet in my life? And is this thing called the church ever going to live up to the call and the purpose of the community that you've asked us to become? For the people at the impasse today, Jesus, somehow, in your grace, in your love, in spite of their white knuckling, would you help them to at least hold steady? Don't get off the trail. And maybe this is the day to re-pick up the cross as the cost of finding life through death. Death to our politics. Death to my selfishness. Death to my want for constant comfort. Death for my desire for things to be easy and pleasurable and still scratch the itch of meaning and purpose. Death to the desire that someone else clip the briars on this path called life for me so I don't have to endure it. Death to death today. Why? Because we are desperate for life. Desperate for life, Jesus. In my heart, I'm desperate for life. In our community, they're desperate for life. You called us to be a city on a hill, like a lamp without a shade. Remove the things that make us burrow down in the valleys of our own self-created ideology, comfort, security, and cultural Christian nonsense. Help us to scale the mountains through suffering and doubt and horrible loss in a world where bricks fall off of buildings, but also in a world where your Spirit buoyed a father who mourned the loss of his wife and his 2 children. Align our story with yours, Jesus, and break our hearts for the people who are on the other path. Mess us up out of our own self-righteousness for supposedly being down the narrow road. Destroy our bastioning of certainty at the expense of relationship with you and people. Break through our strongholds, Jesus. We want to be desperate, Jesus. And for the sages and the followers that are on the further down that upward hill, may they find confidence to look back and reach down and help the rest. Whoever's at the impasse, Jesus, meet them, please. And help us to be a church that welcomes the impasse and has something to offer because of the life we're actually living, not the life we think we have right. In your name we pray. Amen. Death to death and death to deconstruction. Maybe, just maybe, the journey that God's inviting us to is the most real, reconstructing, reconciling, rebuilding journey through heartache and pain that could ever be conceived of, and it's just called apprenticeship to Jesus. Let's not settle for anything less, because you're incomplete without it, and our community needs it. Love you.